these sort of live videos, and it helpfully lets me multicast, as the term is, to a whole bunch of other things. But the best way, if you like these videos and want to follow them and see more of them and interact with them, is to join via HAPS using the link at the head of the broadcast. And this is part of a series of broadcasts I'm doing through June for something called 30 Days Wild, a little project organised by the Wildlife Trusts here in the United Kingdom. And it's about encouraging people every day in June, 30 days hence, to go out and do what they're calling random acts of wildness. Do something where you engage with the natural world around you. And it all depends a little bit on weather conditions. I mean, what I was going to have done was to have run a moth trap last night, and today's broadcast would have been looking through a whole bundle of moths and seeing what had been captured. But the weather last night was terrible. It rained really heavily, and I didn't want to put my moth trap out, both because it could damage the trap and because it got full of water and it wouldn't be any good for the moths. So instead, I thought what I'd do today is just have a quick wander around here in Perivale Wood and would check some of the ponds, see what the water levels are like after the rain, see what we see as we go for a wander around. So I'm going to turn the camera around so you can see the reserve rather than me, and briefly talk about some of the ponds as we look at them. And we're starting here with what we call the sluice pond or the paddock pond. You can see immediately in front some willows, which are a type of tree that's associated with wet conditions a bit more. They can cope with wet conditions better than a lot of other trees, so they survive here. And if we look down, you can see there is some water in the pond here. It's not as full as it has been in the past. This was always a damp bit of the reserve around here, this area. This was always an area where water sort of built up, but a few years ago, probably about 10 years ago now, we decided to have it turned into more of a pond, and we had one of our volunteers who knows how to use the machinery, use an excavator to just dig out a bit more of a pond here, and designed it in the way you can see, with a deeper area, and the area I'm walking on, which is largely grass, a shallower area that only really gets covered at the wettest times. But this gives us a nice bit of a pond. You might be able to see in the water here a tadpole, young of a frog. Quite a few of them actually just sitting on the base there. A lot of reflection off the surface. I haven't stuck a polarising filter on this camera. But this pond, pretty much as soon as we built it, seemed to really be a good one for the frogs, and large numbers of frogs coming, laying their spawn, mating, spawning every year, lots of tadpoles. And yeah, lots of water building up now. So this is a comparatively recent pond, and you can see how, wetland vegetation has taken it over, and how it's these sort of rushy grass things, and how it's been colonised and sort of developed as a habitat quite quickly. Pond skater on the surface there. So pond creation can really quite quickly develop into a habitat. Most of our ponds, in fact all of our ponds in here really, are what you would call seasonal ponds. They're ponds that do tend to dry out at some points in the year. It's not really a problem. Some species obviously won't then be in the ponds. You don't tend to have fish in ponds that behave that way. But for amphibians and a lot of the insects that need the water, they can tend to cope with it occasionally drying out. So that's less of an issue. At the moment though, I mean, a few weeks ago this pond was very low. There's been a lot of rain in the last few days, and the water levels, as you can see, are higher. So we'll walk into the woods now and have a look at another of the ponds, briefly talk about that and its conditions. So we'll just wander relatively quickly through the woods today and not particularly stop and look at things in there unless I see anything particularly noteworthy that I want to share with you. Because we're trying to focus on the ponds today, but you can see the vegetation is rather heavily grown up there and not always fun to shoulder through when it's been raining. But we're coming through into the main body of Perivale Wood now. And we'll go and have a look at the pond here at the slightly lower end of the wood, which goes by the highly imaginative name of the Lower Woodland Pond. So this pond is inside the wood. You see, we are essentially in the woodland, and there's a little dip in the woodland that fills with water. Like the other pond, this is a seasonal pond. It's not always full. So this is actually quite full for it, but the pattern of water in this pond is quite interesting. It can often be empty even when the other ponds are full, and sometimes full when the others are quite low. And I suspect that's to do with the fact that it is here in the woodland with lots and lots of trees around it. And at particular times of the year, the trees are drawing a lot of moisture up through their roots and changing the water table in a way that's quite different to that out in the paddocks. You can see a bit of pondweed building up. I'm not really an expert on that. But this is quite a shaded pond. There's a lot of trees over it. And that does mean that its structure, what's in it, is quite different to the pond we were looking at before. You can see there isn't really that vegetation, there isn't really the sedges and the rushes and the grasses growing around the edge of it. See that the water is quite muddy, and that probably suggests that you've got quite a different population of invertebrates living in the pond. Not really particularly knowledgeable on aquatic invertebrates, so I couldn't go into great depth about it, but it gives a difference and a variety. This pond sometimes gets referred to as the bomb crater pond, and the suggestion being it was formed by a bomb dropped during the Second World War. But actually, you look around it and that's clearly not true. If a bomb had been dropped here in the 1940s, all of these trees, which are older than the 1940s, would not be standing up around the pond. So this pond is not something formed by a bomb being dropped on the reserve, despite it sometimes having that name. We think it might be something to do with human activity in the woods in the past. We think it might be something that was perhaps associated with some sort of woodland working, maybe charcoal making. And we've got a member who's an archaeologist who is thinking about that for us and seeing what we can discover about how this reserve or how this woodland was used many hundreds of years ago, long before it was our nature reserve. So that's another of our ponds. As you see, it's filled up quite nicely with the rain. And then we'll walk on and have a look at some more of the ponds. Again, we'll make fairly rapid progress through the woodland itself and not particularly stop and look at things in here today. There aren't tadpoles in that pond, Fiona. There were in the pond we were looking at earlier, but you've come too late. Again, that pond, probably because of how it's shaded and overgrown, doesn't have the vegetation, isn't going to have what's needed to support much of an amphibian population. Rather different habitats. Probably got some really interesting flies living in it though. Right, just make progress through the woods. coming up to the other end of the wood now. So as you can see, it's not a massive area of woodland. You can walk through it in a few minutes, as we just have, and get to another meadow on the other side. That's slightly worrying that this gate has been left open. Let me go and close that before it causes a problem. And this meadow, you can see, is grazed by cows, of which there are 4. Particularly talk about them today, but they're a useful way of grazing the meadow, stopping scrub encroaching and helping improve the quality of the meadow. But for their Sussex cows, Fiona, don't think they have any horns. Quite placid. They're rather curious. They always stop to have a look at you when you come into the field. Doing a decent job. So here's another of our ponds. This one in Little Elms Meadow, and it's called Little Elms Meadow Pond. There's really not a lot of imagination in the pond naming, I feel. And you can see here, this one's getting more out in the open. This one probably has got a few tadpoles in it, but can't immediately see any. And quite a bit of pondweed built up, which isn't a problem as such. Look, it can sometimes get really excessive and throws out all of the light. And the yellow flowers you can see are yellow flag iris, which is a nice flower. And it has associated with it a little metallic beetle, which let's see if I can do without falling in the pond. Which maybe, where am I? There I am. Okay, there we go. No, don't turn around and look at me. Do that. Yeah, the beetle's crawled away. Let me find another one. Well, there are several down there. So, not going to focus, is it? There we go. The iris beetle. Can't quite remember its scientific name. I think its specific name is something non-striana. Probably because it's not got any stripes. Yes, very small, but lots of them on the iris. So that pond also filling up quite nicely, and we'll look at what's filling it up in just a minute. Let's walk back up through the meadow. So this is what's filling our pond. You can see possibly through here water flowing from the boundary stream on the reserve, and hopefully you can hear it if I stop talking. Okay, signal's poor here, so I will move on a bit further. But one of the things we've put in recently in this pond, thanks to John, one of our volunteers, is a couple of sluices to just help us direct the water. So at the moment we've got this one closed, and that's diverting the water along the side of the field towards the pond we were just looking at. And up ahead we've got another sluice. And we've got that one closed in the other direction, so that one's closed, which is large, stopping too much of the water going into the pond we were just looking at and diverting it off to the right here towards the main pond, which we'll go and look at in a minute. And I'm not sure how well this will show up on Haps, but there is quite a difference in the water level between the side of the sluice that's closed and the downside of it, which is what you want it to do, of course. And the water is flowing largely as we want it along here and off towards the other main pond, which we'll go and look at now. So this field, which has a pond in it, is referred to as Pond Field, keeping with the imaginative naming conventions that we use. And you can see it's got quite an extensive reed bed around it. This is a relatively late successional pond, as the term is. A lot of what was pond has probably now turned into dry, or more dry but marshy land with reeds, which is what happens to ponds if you leave them. They are typically transitional temporary phenomena, and this one is relatively mature, been here a long time. It's got this nice reed bed around it, provides a different habitat, opportunity for breeding birds. We had a reed warbler in here this year, quite nice perching places for dragonflies and damselflies, and we often get them in this pond as well. But you can see here, hopefully, down into the water, lots of reflection, and really quite a densely vegetated pond. I mean, looking at that reed bed, there is a lot of vegetation there. We will get in when water levels are a bit lower and cut some of this out just to keep some open water. But the water levels in this pond are pretty high, pretty close, a long way up on here on this platform that I'm standing on. And that's showing really that those sluices are doing what we wanted, diverting the water in the direction of this pond. And in the direction of the thing up here. So a bit of open water down there. So this is probably our most mature pond, and perhaps one of the ones that's got the most variety of life in it. It's also got a railway line running just past it, making a lot of noise. But it's a very nice bit of vegetation, and hopefully it will be something I can show you a few things in on a future broadcast when it's a bit sunnier. Okay, we're going to have a look at the last pond I'm going to look at, which is in the woodland again. There are a few sort of technical ponds in the reserve, hollow areas that fill up with Fiona seems to be sending me a picture of a crab, presumably because she hasn't got a picture of weird crayfish that she found one of near this pond. So as I say, yes, we have a few sort of slightly weird technical ponds that are really ditches that fill up for very short amounts of time in the year. I'm not going to particularly look at any of them today. They are, on some definitions, ponds, and they do provide a habitat for things, particularly things that need a brief amount of water to breathe, but then don't want long established water. So I think some of the flies, for instance, that use water for their larvae can quite often want the water to only be there for a little bit of time, so the larva can quickly grab some food, pupate, I guess, and then it dries out and doesn't fill up with things like dragonfly and damselfly larvae, which are predaceous. So that variety is really important. But we're not going to particularly look at those extremely temporary ponds today. But what we will do is we'll go and have a look at this last pond. And this pond we're heading to is further up that stream we were looking at that was filling the other ponds. So the stream flows off mainly the nearby Horsenden Hill. It's not a long stream at all. It's essentially just a drainage from a bit of land, a bit of a hill. It flows into here, diverts to the pond we're going to see, partly fills that, and then flows on to the ponds we were just looking at, fills them. So we'll just again make relatively rapid progress through the woods, not particularly stopping to look at things unless something really exciting leaps out at me. Right, heading towards the final of the ponds now. And this one is at the upper end of the woodland, and so we call it Upper Woodland Pond. And it's another of these ponds because it's in a woodland, because it's quite shaded and dark, will not have that richness of vegetation growing in it that we saw in some of the other ponds. And will probably have it does have a very different variety of life in it. But you can see here quite a lot of water in here. Because the water's been flowing in, somewhat muddy, quite a bit of suspended sediment in it. And really, if you look up, you can see there's a lot of shading and a lot of cover over this pond. Which does affect what's in here. It does mean there isn't much. There's a little bit of sort of reedy vegetation at the far side there that you might be able to see. I zoom in. But certainly not vast amounts of it. But again, this is a pond that's has, from some dipterists who visited, got some interesting fly larvae living in it. And got some interesting species that are associated with this slightly duller, slightly less vegetated habitat. And perhaps live in a slightly different way to the things that were in the other pond. So nicely full again. This one's pretty full. And you can see here the stream running out, which is part of that stream that we were looking at before that feeds into the other pond. So it all connects up at this end of the reserve. Anyway, I think we'll stop there. We've had a look at the main ponds in the reserve anyway. Had a look at how they're doing in terms of water levels, and it's all got rather nicely full with the rain we've had. Hopefully the rain will stop and I'll be able to do some proper insect related broadcasts and show you some insects again on future ones. But there we go, that was today's broadcast for 30 Days Wild, today's random act of wildness here in June. And I will see you all tomorrow.